Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I take a look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. Evil is good, a phrase I never thought I would ever say, and the tagline to one of the most unique games I've played in a long time, Dungeon Keeper. The industry was very different when Dungeon Keeper was released. Back then, it was much harder for independent development to be noticed, and while it started to spread with sites like Newgrounds, it wouldn't really take off as a lucrative venture until Humble Bundle and Steam started to become more popular. Because of this, a lot of game development was much more focused on making games that were able to reach a mass market, and had more of a likelihood to be profitable as a result. In many ways, Dungeon Keeper struggled with the same thing that Half-Life did, as it took considerable effort to find a publisher willing to touch the game given how much of a financial risk it was, and few today would have expected EA to be the one to do it. Yet that risk paid off, with the compelling theme drawing people in, and the mix of management and real-time strategy keeping them playing. While there were plenty of games that allowed you to be evil if you so desired, few explicitly put you in the role of the villain, which Dungeon Keeper's marketing took full advantage of. Even now, it's still fairly unique, as there are very few games that emulate what made Dungeon Keeper work. Is it done so sparingly because it's not worth returning to, or simply hard to pull off? Let's find out. The gameplay is the most intricate part of the game, so let's start there. As a Dungeon Keeper, your goal is to create a magnificent dungeon and attract a variety of minions to it by virtue of said magnificence. However, your efforts will not go unnoticed for long, as the humans above will send warriors to root you out, and rival Dungeon Keepers will show up to try and keep you out of what they wrongly believe to be their territory. Your enemy's goal is your dungeon heart, as if it is destroyed, then it's game over. As such, you will need to be prepared for battle, training the minions you lure in while still expanding your dungeon and breaking opposing dungeon hearts in the process. The actual construction isn't too complicated, but there are a few key things to note. When you start out, you are given a small number of rooms that form the basis of your dungeon, and a small number of imps to do your dirty work. These imps can mine out tiles, including the gold you'll need to pay for everything, carry stuff you find, claim territory for you to build on, and reinforce walls to keep intruders out. Minions are attracted into your dungeon at a relatively consistent rate, but which ones arrive will depend on how large the rooms you've constructed are and what rooms you've created outside of the usual baseline. It can be a little unintuitive unless you look at the manual, but even if you're unsure as to what to produce, there are a small selection of minions that appear in most levels regardless of what you create. The premise is simple enough, but not every minion is going to get along with each other. That means you will need to remind these minions who is in charge, by throwing them into your prison or torture chamber, keeping them in different parts of the dungeon, or giving them a slap to say knock it off or get back to work. And yes, you can slap your minions, and it is surprisingly satisfying. Beyond just slapping them, you can pick up and drop pretty much any minion or gold pile you want, up to a maximum of 8. This is useful for breaking up fights or collecting the gold an enemy may have left behind, but is even more useful where your imps are concerned. For the most part, their priority is split between the oldest order you gave them and the closest order to their location. That means if you have them mining gold in one part of the dungeon and your gold reserves are nearby, they may never touch a room which you want them to mine out. Dropping an imp next to something you want done will cause them to immediately focus on it above what they were doing before. There is some inconsistency where wall reinforcement is concerned, but that's because it's usually the lowest priority. This same process works for minions as well, depending on whether you want them to train up, research, or do any number of other things. The only restriction is that you have to place minions in tiles that your imps have claimed, which acts as an elegant balancing mechanic. Whether you enjoy this game is going to come down to whether you find the dungeon building and management to be engaging, and for me, it definitely is. The rooms work together really well, giving a lot to keep track of without being overwhelming. For instance, instead of outright killing enemies you face, you can subdue them and have your imps drag them over to a prison. Once there, you can let them starve to death, which can grant you skeletons, or you can speed up the process by creating a torture chamber, which allows you to extract information from them, convert them to your side, or if they don't break, they'll return as a ghost and still fight for you. Because of that interaction, a room that is only useful for keeping minions in line suddenly becomes a place where you can take advantage of any failed attack on your dungeon. It can be risky, as imps will run away from a fight unless your dungeon heart is under attack, and subdued enemies do wake up after a while, but if they can be taken to the prison and converted, it can be a major power swing. There is also a workshop that allows you to construct traps and doors, which focus on making attacking your dungeon harder. For the most part, I didn't find myself using them all that often because it takes quite a bit of time for the library to finish researching the room, and then it takes even more time to construct everything. Fortunately, you don't have to be constantly placing down new traps, as the position of expired traps will remain, and if the trap in particular is ready, an imp will automatically take it over there when it has time. There doesn't seem to be a way to turn this off, but again, since I didn't use traps a whole lot, it's mostly a nitpick. Beyond just the management aspect, you can also take a personal hand in what happens through a number of active spells. Though most of them have to be researched, they allow you to buff your creatures both in and out of combat, summon more imps, or take direct control of a minion yourself. The possession spell is probably the most interesting one because it allows you to better explore the map beyond an over-reliance on the AI's whim. There is even an entire secret level dedicated to this idea, where you possess creatures to take down the enemy stronghold rather than doing the usual base building. However, the spells highlight the biggest problem I have with the game. The hitboxes are garbage. It's really obvious when you possess a minion and try to use a long-range skill that the minions were designed to auto-aim everything, as even landing melee attacks is more frustrating than it should be. Granted, you're unlikely to use the spell very often, as you need to keep an eye on the entire dungeon, but the other spells aren't very accurate either. There is a really cool lightning spell that allows you to deal quite a bit of damage, but it's so hard to hit with that it's only really useful if you hit a large group or let an over-aggressive computer do the work for you. The cave-in spell works a little better for holding enemy armies back, but it isn't available in most of the levels. And that's all without talking about the camera. Whenever you look at a map or possess a minion, the camera's perspective relative to the rest of the map changes. There are a couple of ways to change the camera's angle apart from that, but it feels like an inconvenience, especially when it's just going to be changed back when you look at the map again. The issue of less than stellar hitboxes comes to a head in the combat, which is the weakest part of the game. Since this is a top-down game where you're playing as a manager rather than a fighter, combat will already feel disengaged, and when you go against a rival dungeon keeper, the game feels like you're just mashing two armies of monsters together and seeing who lives through it. Apart from picking up monsters under fire to take the pressure off of them, there is very little that can be done in combat, as the hitboxes simply don't allow you to reliably hit the minion that you want. You can pick up minions from the combat window if they're taking too much damage, and you can fortunately use spells in the same way, but that's something I had to figure out on my own, and by that time I was on the base game's final level. To be fair, there is sort of a workaround that can come in handy. The game is a computer assistant which can help build your dungeon and do much of the precision you need during combat. It still doesn't fix the feeling of disconnection, but it does make the combat much more manageable, and made fights where I would have lost right off the bat actually possible to win. Supposedly it can be modified to only do certain tasks or act in a certain way, but for some reason it didn't seem to change when I told it to shift focus, which meant it was building stuff when I only wanted it to tamper with my minions. If and when it works, it's still a nice feature to have, despite how overzealous it can be. But that gets into another of my complaints. The game doesn't tell you anything. I ran into a couple of difficulty spikes because it didn't tell me they were going to limit the number and type of minions that I could attract to my dungeon, which meant it was harder to plan ahead, which meant the level felt unfair. The only reason I won the first time that happened was because the enemy didn't have a gem scene, which acts as an infinite resource tile, and meant I could strike one of them from behind and outlast the other. There's also a way to shorten the height of the dungeon walls so that you can actually click on stuff behind them, which you can only find if you go looking in the options menu while in game. I can justify some of this because there is a lot written in the manual, which does come with the GOG version. Hell, it has everything that you could ever want from a strategic perspective, such as what minions are attracted by what rooms, how to manipulate the game to help you the most, and so on. However, while I can forgive some of this because the game came out in an age where manuals were more common, there are some things which even the manual doesn't seem to clarify, such as the part about restricting the minions I had access to. If you want to play this game, just be warned that if you have any questions about how the mechanics interact, you might have to go digging through the manual. That all being said, the user interface, barring the hitboxes, is serviceable. It requires a few more clicks than it should to access some menu items, especially along the left sidebar, but given the game's resolution, it's a forgivable problem. Everything does what you would expect it to, and it does give all of the relevant information you need to do well. The map is also pretty useful, as it gives you a small window near your cursor whenever you're hovered over a specific area. Not only are you getting to see the big picture, you can also get a glance as to what combat level the creatures in that area are at, helping you to pick out who to throw into the training room and how deadly incoming enemies are going to be. The only other way to access that information is unfortunately by hovering over them, which relies on the awful hitboxes, but at least there is an alternative. As for game length and difficulty, there are 20 levels to beat in the base game, 15 extra in the Deeper Dungeons expansion pack, and 5 accessible secret levels, which you unlock from finding secrets in specific levels. Most of the normal dungeons last anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, which means you've got quite a bit to do within the single player content. At first I was worried about that length, as most of the accessible dungeon rooms and spells were given to me by the halfway point, but they managed to keep the variety up through a lot of creative ideas. I mentioned the secret level where you basically play a first-person shooter, but there are also a couple where you have to kill all of your imps in the fastest way possible, another focused around a bunch of imps working together for a big pile of gold, and so on. The level design throughout the game is surprisingly good, teaching you the mechanics and encouraging you to explore by placing more secrets than just access to different levels, which range from buffing all of your minions, taking one with you into the next level, and so on. They also keep the variety up in the actual experience by putting you in different circumstances, ranging from one or more rival dungeon keepers, to defending against the surface world, to how it's all structured, to everything in between. It can be a bit tedious to find everything there is to the levels, especially if you beat them before finding everything, but beyond that there is plenty to explore within each. However, some of that variety came at the expense of the difficulty curve. The reason I found out about the computer assistant was because I basically needed it in order to survive a nasty difficulty spike at level 10, as the enemy is given a ton of monsters right off the bat and isn't afraid to use them. Also, as a fair warning, the last 3 levels and most of Deeper Dungeons levels take a really long time to beat. I would wager that the time I spent on the last 3 base campaigns levels was longer than the rest of the base game combined, and I'm only partially exaggerating there. It took forever. Initially, this was going to be listed as a complaint, as the lengthy levels seemed to overstay their welcome. However, when I took away the need to edit a let's play of the game, at least for Deeper Dungeons, I found myself spending entire mornings and afternoons just trying to beat the levels, and I'll be honest, I have no idea why. I've complained a fair amount already about the usability, and yet when push comes to shove, I still played those lengthy levels for up to 4 hours straight. I think most of it is due to the management aspect being that damn good, to where even when it got ridiculously difficult in those levels, I still wanted to beat it. With the gameplay in relatively good shape, let's take a look at the settings, story, and everything related to it. I was initially worried about playing the bad guy, as your whole purpose through the game is to make everyone's life miserable, if you don't kill them outright. A lot of people play video games to do things they wouldn't be able to otherwise, and sometimes that includes being an absolute jerk to anyone and everyone you meet. For me personally, unless I know you and know that I can act like a sarcastic brat without being annoying, I usually just want to be the nice guy or hero, and that carries over into the games I play and how I tend to play them. Despite my reservations, the writing before and after the levels took me completely by surprise, as it was not only well written, but surprisingly funny. That might seem odd given the subject matter, but there are a number of reasons why this is the case. To start, both the hellish world you reside in and the world above are polar opposites, the former an irredeemable cesspit and the other an idyllic paradise. The sheer amount of juxtaposition employed by the writing makes it work so well, as apparently it's embarrassing that people wish for a long, untroubled life, and it's unfortunate that the populace is only afflicted with aching facial muscles, and not anthrax as we had hoped. Change a few keywords and this could easily be a cheesy Saturday morning cartoon, which makes it even more hilarious. Add on to this a voice actor who has the perfect tone and conviction to pull it off, and I ended up laughing at most of it, even when it refers to the massacre of thousands of bunnies, or disgusted, stinking tulips that would make any right-minded villain turn their nose up at a place. It certainly helps that they only showed a zoomed-out view of the destruction you caused, which means the actual reality of the situation doesn't come into play. It allowed me to laugh at it out of shock without feeling guilty, and I honestly don't care if it brands me as sadistic, but Dungeon Keeper is one of the funniest games I've played in a long time. Whether that speaks more of me or my gaming habits, I'll let you decide.
Buffy Oak. A small location where people simply sit around and enjoy each other's company. They talk, laugh, and sing without ever arguing, drawing daggers and dying in a gurgling rush of blood. A truly bizarre place.
However, the in-game announcers can get annoying. The main announcer usually isn't a problem outside of the first-person secret level, as during that he keeps nagging you about circumstances that you can't control, and it does become grating. However, the rival Dungeon Keepers' voices are designed to be annoying, and most assuredly are. I can understand an abrasive voice for one rival, as it is manageable in that case, but when there are two, there is just constant, repetitive sniping in that high-pitched voice that loses its appeal after the 4th time it's told me that my entrails will decorate their dungeon. Sure, it's still well written, but did it have to be this annoying? Beyond that, the aesthetic and art design does a good job at matching the tone the rest of the game wishes to set. The level briefings, for lack of a better phrase, are a bit jarring compared to the levels themselves, but still sorta work based on the juxtaposition I mentioned earlier. The ambience and music add a lot to the atmosphere, giving the right amount of creepy. It's not Diablo levels of awesome, but it's not supposed to be. We're the evil ourselves instead of the heroes descending to deal with said evil, so it opts for a more menacing soundtrack rather than a haunting one, and does a good job at maintaining that atmosphere. The graphics are outdated, and definitely show their age when you possess a minion, but for most of the game they work well enough. The use of sprites for the minions was a good call to allow them to get more detail, while the rest of the dungeon is laid out in 3D polygonal models. However, for some reason whenever there's a lot on screen, the frame rate can turn into a slideshow, even when I'm not recording. It might be a limitation of DOSBox, and it's not super essential to have a high frame rate, but it does make the hitboxes even harder to manage, and in a game this old, I would have hoped it would run a little better than this. I'm not as familiar with DOSBox, so there might be a workaround I don't know of, but it was a thorn in my side while playing this. Overall, Dungeon Keeper is the most mechanically interesting game I've played in a long time, backed up by a really good theme that is utilized perfectly. I do have my problems with the game's usability and performance, especially where the combat's concerned, but the ability to sidestep that problem, if only partially, and the fact that there are so few games that successfully emulate Dungeon Keeper make it easier to recommend. If you have trouble with micromanagement, this game might be a little frustrating or tedious, but apart from that, it's a very unique game that I think is worthy of your time. Just bear in mind that you'll have to do a decent amount of reading, as the game doesn't tell you very much outside of the manual. If you're interested, you can find it over on GOG. That's all I have for this video, thank you all for watching. Please consider liking and sharing this if you find it deserving, and keep an eye on this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. And with that done, I can cross out the game which I've had on the shortlist since day one. I've heard mixed feelings on the sequel, but perhaps it might be worth checking out as well. I'll have to think about that. In the meantime, I've got an adventure in space to finish up. Until we meet again.